This is Tabletop Babble, and I'm Amber. Hello! Today on the show, I chatted with graphic designer, artist, and game designer from the Philippines, Momatoes. We sat down on June 2nd and discussed getting into art, the draw to graphic design, and then we really got into ARC, her TTRPG that is rules light and tension heavy, where heroes defy the cruel doomsday clock to save the world from a looming apocalypse. She shared her design goals for the game, the changes and process that she went through, and of course the wonderful art and design she created and used to build the book. It's truly a beautiful piece of work that, as of this episode airing, only has 9 days left on the Kickstarter, so go check it out. Hello, Momatoes, and welcome to Tabletop Babble. For my listeners, would you please introduce yourself, your pronouns, and what you do in the TTRPG space?
All right. Hi, I'm so glad to be here. I'm Momatoes. I'm game and graphic designer from the Philippines. My pronouns are she and her. And I've been making a lot of games lately. A lot of them have been narrative. Some of them have been like really hyper-focused experiences like solo RPGs. But I've also illustrated for a couple of other Kickstarters as well. So drawing and making games are basically my two biggest passions in the tabletop RPG space.
This is super exciting because anybody who knows me, I'm also a graphic designer. I haven't done any games yet. Before we get into the exciting game stuff that is happening for you right this moment, I'm interested in, knowing you. Like, for me specifically, being on Twitter in the last, 3-4 years, I have seen more and more RPG Filipino designers, which is like amazing for me because I have been disconnected to the Philippines for a long time, and so it's exciting to see more and more designers. But I want to know you as far as like, how did you get into gaming for RPGs?
For RPGs, I think it started all the way when I was like a teenager, or even just before being a teenager. I came across this super battered copy of Dragonlance, the original trilogy. So my brother owned it. So at the time, I didn't even know it was like linked to a Dungeons and Dragons like property. But when I read it, I think it was one of the first few fantasy books I've ever read. I felt completely transported into its world and into its story. And then later on, I learned that you could do these things called tabletop games, and you could make that same kind of story. So I guess growing up, I started looking for some opportunities, some gaming groups, and in college, I managed to hit like a regular gaming group. But it was only recently, I think around 2019, when I started actually making my own games. So since then, it's been kind of a roller coaster.
I think the online space has been, just more and more, and maybe you can speak to it, supportive in like the indie stuff. Especially like I said at the beginning, where it's like, I'm so excited to see RPGC stuff getting like traction and notice and support right now. So what was your first foray into design? Like, what was like the first game that you started to put together?
Yeah, the first game I ever made was a micro RPG called Capybara Capers. It was totally not a plagiarized version of Honey Heist. I'd like to call it a supreme hack. I upgraded the bear to the superior capybara.
They are. And then were you doing graphic design prior to RPGs, or was RPGs how you got into graphic design?
I started doing graphic design very early on, even during high school. Like, we had this really basic Photoshop class, and I remember drawing an amoeba and like, this is the future of illustration. I need to get onto this. But it would actually take like several years before I could feel even basically confident with my graphic design skills. So it's been an ongoing process. And even now, I always see inspirations from other designers, from other graphic artists out there in the world. And I always keep thinking that it's something that I have to keep improving continuously.
Yeah, I mean, I went to school for graphic design, and I was like, I felt not very creative as a person. So I felt like, oh, I'm not really good at illustration. I'm very good at following template. I'm good at following alignments and structure and like mimicking
Mhm.
other things, but I wasn't very I don't know, like ideas weren't coming to me. So I was like, oh, I can't do fine arts. I'll
Oh
do graphic
no.
design. I'll do graphic design because it's at least it's still getting the same kind of creative spark and feel from it. But so were you illustrating too? Like were you also drawing as well during your like I find when you found graphic design?
I guess roughly they started happening at the same time. So I can kind of really relate actually to what you said about wanting to do fine arts, but also never quite feeling like you're at that step to be like legit artist who is okay to go into art school. So for me that was a lot of the same kind of thinking I would call even baggage. I was drawing a lot in high school, doodling in high school books. My mom would be endlessly annoyed because she'd see my math book and it'd have drawings all over. But I guess with graphic design, you feel slightly more confident. I guess it's easier because you can do the templates, you can follow along tutorials like how to apply blurs or masks or things like that. But with art and illustration, it's always harder because it seems like the structure isn't so available compared to graphic design. So I think roughly I did do drawing and graphic design at the same time, but even until now, I could say I'm more comfortable with graphic design than the art itself.
I definitely feel very similar in that. So I'm interested in knowing what kinds of things did you fill your math book with? Like what were you doodling all the time?
I really wish I could dig up those things, but some of those were just like people's faces, like anime faces. Like anime was kind of being really big in the Philippines also at the same time. But at the time, I was doing original character art, but I didn't know the term for it yet. It was like, oh, this is a cool design. I hope that somebody will make an anime of it someday.
I know I drew a lot of anime stuff. I still have some of my. I remember one time I got in trouble because I drew a bunch of anime eyes in my Bible when I was younger. So this is fun because I love when I get an artist, an illustrator, and graphic designer on the show that also does game stuff because I feel like when you spend so much time in your mind as a kid or young adult drawing and making these stories for your characters too, it's kind of like that draw to TTRPGs kind of like it goes hand in hand almost. It's like
Mhm.
you have this huge, you spent so much time in your imagination that going into RPG is very it's just like almost natural.
Yeah.
So I'm interested, when you first started playing, were you drawing your characters? Were you drawing the stories that were happening as you were telling stuff?
I think when I started playing games, I tried a little bit because it's always fun to imagine like your character doing different adventures, how they would look like in super cool poses. But I didn't actually publish or really share a lot of it at the time because I think when I first started getting into gaming, it was also with a bunch of dudes like I'm not super familiar with. I'm not really that close yet. So I just mostly kept it to myself in a poorly named folder deeply nestled into the pictures of the family computer at the time.
Oh, this is such a it's good nostalgia feeling of me thinking about this stuff too for myself. I love it. Okay, so I want to transition us because I feel like we could talk a lot about your game that's out right now. I wanted to know
Mm.
like all this art stuff because when I look at Arc, which is your game that you have put out right now, is it Arc or is it ARC?
Airs. Oh, art. Yeah.
But either
No need
way,
to make artworks.
Arc works. Okay, so ARC or Arc, when you look at it, it's I don't know, it's something that inspires me as a graphic designer. But for the listeners, let's go ahead and start talking about this game that you've been working on, this labor of love, this passion of yours.
Yeah, so I've been working on Arc since 2019. So that was also the same year that I started diving deep into game design. So the first iteration of Arc was just this super light, I think maybe just 50 pages of content, stapled, basic cardboard cover, and then I would give it to friends or sell it for like $1 or $2 to strangers. So that was the very beginning. But since then, I've had time to grow and also add in some things that I thought would be really good for the game. I added in more content, more art, and now it's just this beast that it's something that is very familiar to me. Like I know it inside out, but at the same time I could sense like there has been a long design history behind this game.
Well, yeah, could you explain what it is? Like what is this game? Like first off to begin with? Yeah.
Yeah. So Ark is basically a rules light, tension heavy fantasy adventure game where anyone can embark as heroes and confront a world ending doom. But it's really up to the table what that doom is. It could be ending the literal world or ending the world that just means the most to the characters. So even in the book, there's some examples of like it could be an Armageddon or it could even be like a cousin's wedding gone wrong. But what makes Arc really shine is that no matter the setting, no matter the story, it uses a blend of real-time mechanics and also in-story mechanics to keep the tension up and heighten the urgency so that by the end of the game, you'd have a really satisfying payoff and challenge as well.
I'm interested in that because tension building in games, I think, can be difficult to achieve. And sometimes I feel like tension also can be related to fear or horror in games as well. Like that's like kind of a way to make that fear or horror come out in games is using tension mechanics. So I'm interested in what is your tension mechanic? How would you build tension in Arc?
So the tension in art isn't exactly tied to horror. It's really more, I guess, tied to the notion of having limited time to make a difference. So basically being aware that there will be consequences to what your hero will do. So the tension comes in whether or not your hero can actually enact the change needed to make the world much better off, or if your hero will need to contend with the consequences of their action or inaction. So basically, the tension really is making that limitation up front. It's really out there in your face. Like there's a doomsday clock, and you literally have to check it every half hour to see if the limited time is still there or it is going faster even more.
Okay, so is it a GM-less game or is there a GM or some sort of facilitator that can run this game?
Yep, there is a GM called the Guide. So they're the ones in charge of setting up the world and making sure that there are some subplots called omens. So these omens tie into the Doomsday Clock just to make it sure that the world feels like it has many breathing components. So these are the different events or subplots that heroes can pursue, and the guide is basically making sure that the hero's actions, the consequences of those actions actually reflect in the story. But even during the setup, during the session zero, there are extensive prompts and tools to make it clear that while the guide is literally guiding the story along, the the scope of the story, what kind of world it is, even what kind of heroes they want to be, it's up to the table to decide. So there is a sort of collaborative core at the center of every story of Arc.
Sure, because that's my kind of feeds into my next question, where I was wondering if there was some sort of I don't know setting, or is it pretty blank slate for the table to make up for themselves?
So it's pretty much geared towards fantasy settings, but within that fantasy setting, there is a lot of variation you can do. It could be high fantasy. We once had an actual play where we were like wizards at a college, so that was pretty fun. But the only real mechanical reason why it's limited to fantasy at the moment is that the default inventory items, the default spells are more aligned to the fantasy genre. So anybody who wants to hack it for like different kinds of settings, cyberpunk, modern, can certainly do so. And I'd be really happy.
Yeah, I know. There's something. It feels so good when somebody's like, "Oh, I love this. Let me add to it." It feels a good feel. Another question then is, I'm interested in: do you have stuff like like you mentioned that there's a spell list and stuff? So are there playbooks? Are there character classes and stuff like that?
The very first iteration of ARC had character classes, but eventually, as I changed it to the next version, I decided to drop it because I just wasn't meaningfully using character classes. I found that in RPGs, they were actually really engaging for me if you felt like each class was like had a very unique theme that applied to the mechanics, whether that's with the progression or that's with the specific moves you can do for that character class. With the first version of ARC, I wasn't really happy because it felt like the character classes, as they were just templates for starting inventory and starting powers. So I didn't actually build a meaningful framework for advancement or for specialization. And at the time, since I wanted to focus on very focused experiences and play sessions, I decided this is maybe out of scope for ARC for now and opened it up so that anybody can play any hero that they want.
Usually when, well, this is my experience, not everybody's experience, right? Where you come from Dungeons and Dragons or your, OSR games, like those older, like we're rolling a d20 and stuff, coming into to something like Arc, where you don't have that framework at first for like what a character class is. It's interesting. I'm used to it now, being in indie games in space, but so when you make your hero, is there like a prompt list, or is there questions? Like, how would I build my hero?
So when you build your hero, you basically are encouraged to think of like what kind of hero it will be. But as it goes on through the hero creation process, it doesn't really give you explicit guidance really on something like if you want to do a wizard, these are the skills you should get. It's more of these are how the skills can be applied in the world. So if you feel it makes sense for your character, you can go ahead and get them. And with some other stats like the problem solving approaches, whether you apply your skills creatively, carefully, or concerted, it felt like it was fairly independent of character classes. So it's focusing more on what feels right for your character concept. So if your character concept is wizard, you just pick the skills that you feel correspond to that. There isn't any penalty for choosing skills that don't align to that concept perfectly. It's fairly free form as well.
I really love that because there's I've been really into superhero stuff lately, and if people listen to these episodes in order at all and not pick and choose, they'll hear me talk about superheroes in each episode. But there's a documentary I watched with Stan Lee talking about heroes. It was called Behind the Mask, and that basically we like the heroes because of who they are, not necessarily because of the powers that they have. So I'm kind of getting that similar vibe where it's like, so in Arc, are skills important to your hero? Does it have, I don't know. I think about people who min max, right? Who like play games are like, I'm gonna do XYZ and I'm gonna be this kind of character. Are the skills set up in that kind of way?
All right, so that's a really good question and something that I really encountered as a design challenge early on. So I had to move around a lot of skills because I didn't want them to be hyper useful for one specific scenario. So one example that I could think of right now is stealth. So you could specialize in stealth for sneaking about, but that's it. That's the application of that skill, and that didn't really jive with me. So I really considered the skills, and it's also mitigated by the fact that succeeding at something isn't just a matter of character expertise. in some ways, I am pulling a bit of inspiration from OSR in that if you as a player has some knowledge on how to apply a solution, that can give you bonuses. So skills actually interact with these stats called approaches. So for example, you're trying to investigate a statue, you can say, I'm going to use the skill observe in a careful way because I'm going to compete for details. But say if you as a player decide as a solution, I'm gonna use observe creatively or even artisan creatively so I could check for the artistic motives. So I could track it to some artists or painters that I know from town, and then we can get some leads from there. So you can use skills and approaches in ways that complement character ability and player ability, which I find really cool.
No one can see this, but I'm like lost in thought and my mouth is open. I really like the idea of having a skill, but then you can change your approach to the skill. So, would you mind? Do you have another example, like of a skill and an approach that somebody could do?
Oh yeah. Let's say, oh, I'm gonna turn it around. How about you give me a scenario and then I'll take you to think of a
Oh,
skill and
okay.
approach.
Oh no, it's too early.
Yeah, viewer participation is required.
Okay. Good. Okay, let's say that I am a thief and I'm being really basic. I'm trying to pick a lock. And
Okay.
I would like there's a lock door, but it's not a normal like door handle lock. It's obviously some sort of several like a tumbler situation
Yeah,
here.
yeah,
We've
yeah.
got three things. I got to do stuff in a certain way. Yeah.
Okay, so if you're a thief, I think the most immediate solution that I could think of is using like the tinkering skill, which is more engineering. So that means, oh, I've seen this lock before. I used to play around with these locks when I was a kid, so I'll tinker around with it carefully or concertedly by putting a lot of effort and basically jamming it open. So that's the engineering approach. There could even be like I could use physique to crush this lock as much as I can. But we you could even use things like if your character is more theoretically leaning, they could use like academic to think, oh, I know the alloys that are basically behind this lock. I know that this is very weak against acid. Or even something like folklore, like I know that this lock can be unlocked by the shaman who is the head of this temple. Let's steal the key from him.
I think that is genius because in my experience with like D&D going through like 7 years of it, you get so locked into I do fireball. I do
Yeah.
this one thing. This is all I do. And I think even in trying to branch out into Powered by the Apocalypse world and like even with like Blades in the Dark where you can like use any skill, but I just like this this is so good. You've talked about it a couple times already or hinted at it that you've had to change things and one of the biggest design challenges was figuring out the skills and then letting go of character classes. So what else has happened in the design development of Arc that you've changed or that you had to add or remove? Like what else is there?
Yeah, so since the very first edition, I think one of the bigger changes has been adding more fun. I guess that's the word I would use. More fun spells and techniques. Because before it was just you had spell slots that would refresh every day. And then I was trying to write how to explain what spell slots were. I was trying to imagine I was a first time gamer. I had no idea how to explain spell slots in like a meaningful way. So I decided, I had a couple of talks with some really great designers, and I had the idea of what if spells, what if powers were like inventory. So they were copies that you held and they could be gone. So it's kind of like spell slots in a way, but these copies, these instances, don't instantly replenish when you sleep. I added in a condition called rituals. So these were unusual things that you had to do so that you could basically align with Arcana or whichever explanation makes sense with the setting, and you could recover the spells that you had lost. So there is one spell there, I think, where the ritual was that you had to learn somebody's secret. So unless
Mm.
you could do that ritual, the copies of that spell won't happen again. So it's like one time use. If you're not overly concerned about getting that spell again, no big deal. But if you want to keep using it, you have to actually do something meaningful to the plot so that it actually comes back to you.
The more I'm hearing, the more I'm like, yes.
Although
I love it.
some of the rituals were also just for fun. One of them was like your character had to sleep for like 20 hours and another was your character had to eat a door somehow. So
Eat a door?
yeah,
I
but
guess, I mean, that
there's
makes sense.
there's the caveat that of course the table can veto any, but I thought some of them had to be fun. I had to have some sense of humor somewhere.
That's funny, adding fun, because like, so I'm interested in when, okay, so usually, and this is again my perspective, the way that my approach to stuff is very goal oriented. I want to invoke a certain kind of goal or feeling or idea through whatever it is I'm creating. So initially, what was your goal with Arc?
The first goal I had was basically the concept of the limited time and the high stakes and high urgency. That was really at its very core, but it's kind of evolved over the couple of years as it was developed.
Yeah, so say, how many years have you been working towards this game?
Since 2019, so I would guess 2 years,
2 years, two
thereabouts. Yeah.
years. So prior to us talking here, we were exchanging DMs, and then you mentioned that you had a phone call that had you completely overhaul your game. What was that about?
So that shortly happened after Exalted Funeral said, we're interested in partnering your game, even publishing it, and we're gonna assign our creative manager to help you through the development of the game. So that person was Luca Reyes. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, but he's the creator of the Ultraviolet Grasslands, which has been a super big inspiration for me. We only ever had one call because Luca eventually had to focus on his many different projects. But I remember having that call. I didn't schedule it properly and I forgot, so I was actually eating a burger when the call came on Discord. But we went through the mechanics and it was, I guess, the first time I actually tried like critically looking at the mechanics, because a lot of it was just me applying what felt intuitive at the time. So that was me adding character classes, I had spell slots. A lot of the rules were basically cribbed from games that I liked. But during that call, as we went through the rules and what made Arc unique, I realized that there actually wasn't much at all at the center of it. So that made me have a moment, an opportunity to really assess the my goal for Arc and look carefully how am I actually applying it in the game, and is the game enabling the experience that I want players to have. So from there, it's been weeks, a couple of months retooling it, doing some small play tests, and eventually finally being happy to get it out in Kickstarter this month.
Yeah, which is like, okay, so it is on Kickstarter currently, and when this episode comes out, it should still be going.
Sometimes, winning a game isn't about dealing the most damage, or drawing the most cards, or making any measurable contribution towards victory. But hey, just because you don't have the stats doesn't mean you're not a f***ing gamer god, alright? Enter The Intangibles, a podcast on the Geekspective Network, where me, Kenny, and my brother Matt break down all the things that are hard to quantify in games. All kinds of games. We're talking classics like Sonic's the Hedgehogs, and chess, and 3D Pinball Space Cadet. Great game, by the way. We're talking new releases like
Insert latest trending games on Twitch here.
single player, co-op, competitive, card games, board games, role-playing games, play-by-mail games, the Wakes. We do deep dives into our favorite games, digging into the intangibles that make them great and the intangibles that will make you a better player, and hey, maybe even a better person. Check out the intangibles on whatever the heck platform you're listening to right now.
I want to get into, though, now that we've talked a lot about the game itself and I'm excited for it, I want to talk about the design.
Ooh.
Because it is, first glance, so beautiful. Like this, and you did all of the artwork and the layout for it?
Yeah.
Oh, that seems like so much work.
Yeah, it's a bit weird because a lot of the art is actually not really designed for art at all. It's actually, a lot of it's personal pieces. So it's really my personal aesthetics that, it fits in this chapter. Let's use that. So I was able to save up on hours of effort of that, but it's kind of interesting because obviously I still had to be picky because I just can't put in the doodle of my OC from the high school math book. But it was the combining of an aesthetic vision. The one good thing about doing everything by yourself is you know how to express that vision. Even if you can't vocalize it to other people, you have like an innate feeling that this art fits, this design fits for this particular spread. It's really hard because it's a lot of effort, and I think I would have had a happier, restful time over the past few months if I learned how to delegate to other people. But I'm really glad that it's paid off for a lot of people and they really appreciate how it's turned out.
One of the things I want to praise you for is, as I'm looking at the spreads of the text, right? Because that's a huge thing right now, is accessibility and readability and stuff in design. Whereas even though you're doing and for the listeners, I'm going to try and describe the art and the style. It has a very eclectic, collage feel to it, painterly collage feel to it overall. And especially in your typography, you've used several fonts, right? It's still very readable. Even though you use different font faces and stuff, and I'm like, this is so good. So I want to know, I don't know how to ask this because it's hard to ask an artist, what's your process? Because sometimes when you do stuff, it's just like,
yeah,
I liked it. But
oh, no.
yeah. So I guess kind of how did this evolve? What was it like for you as you were putting all of this together? What was your inspiration? What were you driving towards with your aesthetic here?
Oh, you might be disappointed because my first answer was just I like it, but
yeah, I said
the real artist dilemma, right?
Yeah, I think it looked cool.
But let me, I guess, put some words into it because while I liked it, there were reasons why I liked it. I've had other games that I tried designing where the aesthetic was quite different. So for those, I like the aesthetic for those games, but for different reasons. For Arc, I actually had a few iterations of the layout and the typography, but a lot of it has mostly been finding a really great font and thinking I want to create a layout around this font, and then seeing if it works, and then if it doesn't work, I'll try to look for a different font. Or I see an inspiration like White Hack has really beautiful white space and great layout. And seeing things like Morkborg, which is the absolute complete opposite of that, and thinking, oh, I want to combine both of them and see what comes out. So it's actually a lot of small iterative experiments, and then at each experimental stage thinking, not so readable, or I want this aspect but not so much this aspect, and then over a few weeks over several naps because as an artist, I need to nap first. Otherwise, the design will look wonky and I can't assess it as objectively. It began building up to a more concrete aesthetic.
Yeah, that sounds about right. As I think about my design and stuff, where I mean, because like I feel like going back to what we were saying earlier about choosing graphic design because you don't feel confident in your own creative illustration stuff, and like looking at other inspiration. I love Morkborg too. I think Morkborg is one of the coolest looking game books out there. Maybe not the most readable, but the most cool looking things. And I think I can kind of see I'm looking at your Kickstarter, right? Kind of see how you thought about like trying to combine that with a more like minimalist looking like readable stuff. I don't know. I think it's just beautiful.
Thanks.
It's truly like, this is the part of the podcast where I just praise you for 5 minutes, where I'm like, wow, this is amazing. I truly am inspired by this. And I don't know what to talk about after that because I'm just like in awe, like over here looking at your Kickstarter. It's dark. But it feels, I don't know, the painterly quality of stuff. So let me stop drooling over your art and talk about like the tools that you use. So what are you primarily using when you do your illustration?
So I use Photoshop CS3. So I think that's been released 2012, 2011.
Hey, you know what? It works.
It works, yeah. But I've actually been really wanting to shift to another platform. Recently, I had a game jam called F Adobe. You can guess what the F stands for. And I'm trying out Clip Studio Paint as well because it's not really a sustainable thing for me. And I feel for a lot of game designers to use platforms that are obnoxiously expensive or hook you into these exploitative contracts.
I'm unfortunately stuck in the Adobe world because it's not, I don't pay for it. Work pays for it. That's one of the reasons why I use it, but it is not a very accessible tool for people. So you're looking at Clip Studio. Is that what it is? Clip Studio?
Yeah, Clip Studio Paint.
Clip Studio Paint. I've been using Procreate is another one, but it also is kind of like expensive. I've heard Paint Tool Sigh, if you're on Microsoft, is also a good one. Okay, so for your layout, then how are you doing layout? Because going back to like F Adobe, if people don't have access to Adobe, it's nice to talk about what other options are out there. So what are you using for layout?
So for layout, I was stuck on InDesign CS3 for a while, but I'm hoping to migrate eventually to Affinity Publisher, which has just the same features as well, although of course it will be a different user experience. But I've heard really good things from a lot of fellow game designers. I also had, it's not Arc, but I want to mention it because it's really funny to me. One of my recent games called The Magus was laid out in PowerPoint, and it's actually one of my more aesthetic games also. I feel like for a lot of starting game designers, you can get a lot of mileage from really accessible tools. And I kind of want to make a highlight of that in this podcast because what I felt were more important were the fundamentals, were learning how to do layout and graphic design well, or being confident in your skill, learning to apply different inspirations, and the tool will help you get there. But the big layout tools, you don't really need like 80% of the features there. Like I only had to cram how to do indexing when I exported Arc, but for every game I've ever released, I never ever had to use it.
I've talked about character sheet design at conventions and stuff, speaking panel, and I tell people all the time, as long as you know like the fundamentals of hierarchy and organizing your information, like you could make a character sheet that you draw out with a Sharpie on a piece of paper and Photoshop it. Using a spreadsheet, is you can build some amazing things using Excel, you know?
Yeah.
And like, and of course, why not use PowerPoint? Because you can export it as a PDF when you're done.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So okay, so we talked a lot about Ark, but the Magus was another game that you made.
Oh yeah. I'm super proud of it. I hope you can Google it, and I hope that the listeners will Google it right now at this very second. It is a game I released January of this year. For the first month, every proceed went to charity, and it was also a challenge for me because I was in love with the concept of a solo RPG where you play a wizard who is trying to balance their ambition with their need for human connection. And I also had a couple of really weird arbitrary design challenges for myself, like make a solo RPG using every dice in the polyhedral set, make make an RPG with a really good graphics and aesthetic using only PowerPoint and public domain art or AI generated art. And it's been, I guess, my most successful game after Arc.
That's such a good. I love that you set up a design challenge for yourself at the beginning, because I think I've talked about with other people where it's like to have that actually pushes your like creativity and you get to make some really interesting choices that come out in fun ways.
Yeah.
I need to know what inspires you. Like, what games have been like your like, wow, I feel like me looking at your stuff and going, oh, this inspires me, I want to create. For you, what's that?
It's a bunch of different things. Sometimes some games inspire me for aesthetics, like Morkborg, like holy crap, I didn't know it was possible for RPG books to be this cool. Some books inspire me for like the depth of imagination, like the Ultraviolet Grasslands, which is its own setting. So it's like Oregon Trail, but in a land where there are cat lords, where there are porcelain princes in their cathedral. So it's really fantastic. And of course, there are some games that you, I guess, would feel silly admitting would be inspirations, but games like Lasers and Feelings, Honey Heist, The Quiet Year, new ways to approach mechanics and rules that are highly accessible and yet create very specific experiences that it's really hard to find laser focused games like those. But one thing I also want to highlight is that Arc was a baby of a lot of inspirations and not just video games. So years of like being exposed to movies, songs, stories, they've blended together. So it's hard to pick one specific inspiration. But something that I really want, especially starting indie game designers, to realize is that you don't just have to look for games for inspiration. There is a world of creative output out there, and each one of them can power your game in very powerful ways.
This is very true. A lot of my inspiration comes from anime, because of course it does. One last question, kind of like a statement then question. So first off, congratulations, because Arc has successfully funded, it's hit its goal. I want to know how do you plan on celebrating this success? You need to take time to celebrate yourself. How do you plan on doing that, if you don't mind sharing?
I haven't even thought about it yet. It's one of those things where you get used to doing the layout, doing the graphics, doing even the trailer. That the thought of stopping or resting is putting me like a deer in headlights. It's like, what do I do now? I'm supposed to just stop. But what is this? What am I supposed to do? So yeah.
I was gonna say, I could eat every designer who comes on this show. Everybody I know, it's like I just have to keep going. I keep going. I don't know how to I'm like, no, you have to celebrate yourself. Take some time.
Yeah, you have to learn how to do that exactly. I think maybe I will take a couple of days off my day job, shut down social media for a while, and then sleep or watch capybara videos, whichever feels like doing.
Oh, there was something I watched recently. I'm going to share this with you.
Okay.
on Netflix where it's like these little guinea pig cars.
Oh, I watched Small Car.
Molcar!
I love
Yes!
Molcar.
Yes, I love it too. I thought it was like, you talk about capybara, I'm like, okay, yes, watch more Molcar. Take a few days.
Spread the gospel of Molcar.
Yes, everybody watch Molcar. Okay. Well, I want to thank you first off for coming on, but for my listeners, if they want to find your stuff, where could they do that?
So I'm always online on Twitter. It's just at Momatoes. I also have a website, momatoes.com, but just bring me on Twitter. I will usually reply with a capybara emote one way or another.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for coming on and sharing. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. You can find me on Twitter at Rocket Orca, Kenny as at Wolfmere, and John is at Crossways GM. Tabletop Babble is part of the Geekspective Network. Go to geekspective.com to check out all our other shows or follow us on Twitter at Geekspective. Our theme music was provided by the Battle Bards.